Hello, and thank you for joining us at Percona Live online as we start our Day 1 keynotes. 2021 is the 15th anniversary of Percona, so it seems appropriate that this year is our biggest ever Percona Live conference with over 200 sessions, 160 speakers covering a wide range of open source database topics. We appreciate that in these challenging times, there are many online conference options to choose from. So I'd like to thank you for supporting open source database community and attending Percona Live. I also want to give a big thank you to everyone who's contributed to this year's conference. We especially want to thank the 100+ speakers, our community room partners, and the Percona team that's been working hard behind the scenes. So without further ado, let's jump right into our keynotes. First up is our CEO and co-founder of Percona, Peter Zaitsev. Peter will be discussing the changing face of open source database adoption and how the market has changed over the past year.
Hello, everyone. Today, we'll talk about the changing face of open source database software. Now, let me first share a perspective. If you know Percona, you know what our passion is really to help you to get the most out of your open source database software, because we believe the open source is better. And I hope you too. Now, it is not just us. We recently surveyed about 200 decision makers, and the results pretty much reinforced our thinking in this regard. The whole 100% believe what open source software actually provides benefit to their organizations, 96% what that encourages more innovations, and with that, 78% increased the use of the open source software over the last 12 months. So things are looking good in this way. Now, if you look at open source, I think one of the big discussions what have been happening those days is open source and the cloud, and how cloud impacts open source. But before we talk about cloud and open source, I think it's interesting to look at the history of a cloud, and especially as that was promoted initially. This is the picture I pulled out from Amazon Web Services advertisement from the time when we did not really understand the clouds very well. And at that time, they have been positioning the cloud as something which compares to electricity. Right? It's pretty silly for most of us at least, to create our own electricity at home. It is much easier and more convenient to just buy that from utility provider, right? Cloud is the same thing. Well, but there is one very important difference here. The electricity at large is commodity. Yes, in many places you can choose your vendor for electricity. You can buy maybe more reliable electricity or green electricity. But in the end, your fridge will still continue to work. That is not what cloud evolved to be, right? That has really became a very much locked in ecosystem where if you buy the fridge, it will only provide work with a given electricity supplier would be an analogy. And I do not think what that is a very good thing. If you think about the cloud, in the early days, the cloud promised to open source sound amazing, right? If the cloud is a commodity, a lot of value remains in the open source software, and that's the cloud really makes open source software adoption easier, right? Because instead of having a complicated ways to get server racks or other complicated and expensive ways, you can just spin out the instance in the cloud and use that for open source software of your choice. But that is not how things evolved. If you think about the cloud and open source, many of the open source software was took by the cloud vendor, integrated and in their cloud platform, extracted and offered in their proprietary, fully managed version. And what really happens in this case is what that redirects a lot of the revenue stream from the open source developers to the cloud vendors. With that, let me cover this graph a little bit. And this is an interesting perspective what you have to be thinking about for a license choice for vendors. On one side, you have a permissive licenses. And the permissive licenses are very great to maximize your distributions because anybody can use that for any purpose, commercial or not. You can build closer software based on that very permissive license. For example, that's how PostgreSQL is distributed, right? And then all the way to the right, you have a proprietary software which actually restricts distribution because now you would have to uh, agree to the license terms of for any use, and typically that costs money. But that maximizes monetization because you, as a vendor, have a choice to charge every single user of your software, and that would be Oracle as example, right? Oracle is not nearly as widely distributed as PostgreSQL, but they make a ton of money from the database. And what was the response of the open source with this issue in the cloud? What happened here is what the open source vendors, and I put it in a quotes because open source really often means open core in this case. But they started to invest less in open source and embrace even not open source or less permissive open source licenses. With the idea is, well, if we do that, we'll force cloud vendors to the negotiating table and we will negotiate something between us. Here are some of the examples of the companies which took this path recently. Elastic, CockroachDB, Redis Lab, MongoDB all moved to non-open source licenses. Their Grafana, they just moved slightly more right on this graph, going from very permissive Apache license to the AGPL license, which has more restrictions. What is very interesting for me is to look at how those changes impact what the markets think about those changes. And this can be best seen with Elastic and MongoDB because those are both public companies. We can see in these cases that MongoDB stock has grown significantly from the time when they did that change, while Elastic is about the same. Though it's hard to really to get like a correlation causation here because of everything which was going on with the market. But what is interesting for me is if we see companies are able to public companies are able to switch from open source to proprietary licenses, that is probably what their boards will be very much pushing on, and we will likely see more of those changes, even if there are strong forces inside of those companies which would like to stick to open source. Another thing what I would like for us to consider or think about is the length of a game. There is this famous book by now called Infinite Game, which talks about what there are some games which are very fixed, right? And you know, by the end time you, for example, finish playing chess, wherever you end, won or lost. And then there are infinite games, right? There you don't really quite have that point of winning or losing, and things can change as a game progresses. For a lot of startups, I think going public and making sure what the founders and initial investors are paid out, right, or maybe selling to some company, that can be considered as a end in that finite game they played, where success can be celebrated. But if you think about the open source, I think about that as a infinite game. There are in many cases it takes a long things to play out something, and a lot of things may happen. For example, in something I have witnesses is a decade ago, right, or more, MySQL was kicking ass. It was really getting a lot more adoption, a lot more traction than Postgres. And now I think the tables have turned. And while MySQL is still probably more adopted than a PostgreSQL database, I see a lot more momentum in a PostgreSQL's space happening. So same as we look at those companies which change the license and open source, while I think that can even benefit their stock prices in the short term, I would be much more interested in about the impact in a decade or more after that change. Another interesting thing is the partnership between open source in a cloud. You can see is what those partnership pretty much result in a proprietary solution which ends up operating jointly by the software vendor and a cloud vendor, right? And the value which is kind of created being shared between the vendors, cloud and software, but it's not really available to the customers. And solution instead, and the resulting solution, right, is pretty far from the open source. What also we have as a result of this cloud competition is what there is a lot of work which is being duplicated just for the sake of duplicating that because it's not available in the open source. For example, while Amazon built the MySQL fork called Amazon Aurora, I know many of the other cloud teams are working on something similar, pretty much re-implementing the effort. While if a solution would be available in open source space for everybody benefit, you would not have wasted those work, right? And waste is not a good thing. In my opinion, the better answer for open source communities would be to do open source for real and really to pool your resources to build a kick up open source. That really happened in the past already, right? Open source companies, developers get together and they build Linux, which became the best Unix compatible operating system compared to those well-funded, well-engineered Solarises, HPUXs, and so on and so forth, right? Or even Windows, right? And I believe what we can do it again, and especially in the open source database space. And that will really allow us to provide more value to the customers while sharing the costs between the vendors. So we also can be all profitable and growing companies. Now, from a cloud vendor standpoint, I would encourage to find a way to support open source communities, open source projects without having some very complicated and expensive partnerships, right? That and what has been happening now. We all know what open source projects, think about Postgres, for example, or Drupal. They generate a huge spend on those clouds, but they don't benefit on that. And I think figuring out how the fruits of this could be shared without those projects have to charge their users later more because, well, that's not how open source works. Right? So that would be my encouragement. Now, switching to the database in particular. In the database space, I believe the open source has won. It's much more simple and more practical way to deploy your database. And it helps us to reduce the toil, to maximize automation. And really that empowers developers to build the better apps faster. And that is what a lot of companies are about those days. The problem, though, is what the database as a service currently really takes us very much away from the open source. All the solutions which are available right now, whether that is from major cloud vendors or major database software vendors, or even third parties, are the proprietary solutions which require you software lock-in on once or another scale. Percona vision is to provide you with the open source database as a service. Their solution is 100% open source. You can keep control of your data. You can choose and move the data between the cloud or stay on-prem. And that is a big effort, and they're not quite there yet, but we have this database as a service functionality available as a technical preview in Percona monitoring management. And I would very much encourage you to test it out, provide us feedback, and maybe even participate in development, because the more feedback we get, the faster we can make it awesome. For us, the foundation of a database as a service solution is based on Kubernetes operators. And we invest a lot in this to make sure we have some of the best operators in the industry, which are focused both on day one and day two operations. So the idea is what you can use Percona monitoring and management for your database as a service, GUI or API, or you can use Percona operators directly in your Kubernetes environment if that is something what you comfortable with. Right, you can just use that directly. Now let me look quickly at the core database service software for MySQL, PostgreSQL, and MongoDB, because these are the areas where Percona works. The interesting is what the core database service software in many cases is not going to give you everything what you would want to have. In the MySQL and MongoDB space, you have intentionally crippled community versions, which are available as open source, and the full features versions are proprietary. In PostgreSQL case, while there is only one Postgres and it's only open source, there are many features which are only available in a proprietary PostgreSQL forks, right? So in many cases, if you really want to run large-scale, mission-critical enterprise applications, you have to go proprietary. And guess what? At Percona, we want to make sure you do not have to, right? So we are looking at providing software which meets both mission critical and enterprise deployment needs while being 100% free and open source. With that, we are both implemented many enterprise only features for MySQL and MongoDB, and we are also working in this space in Postgres. If you look at our specific innovations, for MySQL, we have built a solution for high availability called Percona XDB cluster. We have a MyRock storage engines, which really helps for write optimized workloads, and iOS helps you to save money in the cloud. We have also did a lot of work with a hot backup for MySQL, and in particular, being able to do the backups directly to the cloud, which is very valuable those days. We also have probably the most mature and advanced Kubernetes operator in the MySQL ecosystem. For MongoDB, we put a lot of focus at the open source Kubernetes operator, which now has a full support for sharding. And also we built Percona backup for MongoDB, which is our open source consistent backup solution for replica set and sharded clusters. We thought that was a piece which is really missing in the open source MongoDB ecosystem. We needed that to be built. For PostgreSQL, well, frankly, PostgreSQL is the newest member of a PostgreSQL portfolio, so we don't have as many things we can be proud yet, but more is coming. One of our focus right now was building pgstat monitor extension, so we can provide even deeper insights for PostgreSQL query performance, and that also integrates with our tool of Percona monitor and management. Also on this event, we are launching Percona operator for Postgres, which is now as a tech preview, but we are hoping we'll stabilize that pretty quickly. And also we are having managed services available for PostgreSQL. We have been now available for MySQL and MongoDB for quite a few years, but we had a gap where I would be only doing professional services and support for Postgres, but now that gap is being closed. With that, I just wanted to finish up by restating my belief. What there is a lot of work to do, and there is a lot possible with pushing the boundaries of open source database software. And I believe together they're individuals and vendors which really stick to the open source values, we can push those boundaries and really achieve a lot. Finally, let me finish up by unrelated, but it's something I'm quite proud of. In 2021, we're celebrating our 15 years anniversary at Percona, and we built a little ebook with some stories about Percona, right, to celebrate that. You can follow the link on the slide to download that if you like. With that, thank you. That's all ahead.
Thank you for that insightful talk, Peter. A great way to kick off our keynotes. For anyone interested in finding out more about the survey results mentioned in Peter's presentation, these will be discussed in a post on the Percona blog later today. If anyone has questions for Peter or any of our presenters, please post them into the chat on the right-hand side of your screen. Our next presentation takes us across the Atlantic to the United Kingdom, where Amanda Brock, the CEO of Open UK, will be presenting the challenges and opportunities for open source software.
What is open source software? It's software where the source code is freely available and where it's distributed under an open source initiative or OSI approved license that complies with the open source definition or OSD. And that's something that I bet very few people listening today could actually recite to me. It's also a licensing model, a socio-political movement, and a development methodology. And it's definitely, absolutely the development methodology that's preferred by young developers today. It allows innovation and it runs our internet, our clouds, our databases and AI. And according to Tidelift's 2020 survey, over 90% of stacks actually include open source software and over 70% of them is open source. As someone said to me when I was working on Open UK's State of Open report, phase 1 was published back in March, it's like gravity. It's all around us, it's everywhere, there's no escaping it. Mark Andreessen of Andreessen Horowitz famously said that software is eating the world back in 2011, and Jim Zemlin of the Linux Foundation retorted with open source is eating software's lunch. People see open source in the way that they've experienced it. So if you've experienced it as a couple of people setting up a project, building a community, building a company on top of that, maybe hiring the community along the way, maybe like a HashiCorp or MongoDB, that's how you'll think of it. If you're an individual developer who scratched a niche, created something like the Linux kernel, attracted over 15,000 contributors in the last 30 years, created software that's changed society, that's how you'll view it. If you've been part of a company's non-differentiating, non-permanent collaboration through something like OpenStack, the Linux Foundation or Eclipse or one of their projects, that's how you'll view it. Whichever model you've experienced will impact your view on open source and how it works. Open source today is part of technology and everything that it's trying to achieve. Back in 2008, I joined Canonical, and that was my experience, my first experience of open source. And I joined as the head lawyer, I was general counsel, and I spent 5 years there working on the commercialization and business models around open source. I was a point of escalation in most of the deals. And I want to think a little bit about that right now. Of course, in that 5 years, things changed. And it changed dramatically where we moved from a world where software was generally distributed and worked on-prem to a world where most software was utilised in the cloud or the platform economy. Now I'm going to introduce you to Open Source Underdogs, which is my favourite podcast. And let's start by seeing Canonical's founder, Mark Shuttleworth, and hearing what he has to say.
There's a real sort of double challenge in starting a tech operation that is open source. Starting a tech operation is always hard because you want to do something new, and that's surprisingly difficult. You genuinely have to do something different if you want to be successful, from a technology point of view. And most of the people who would have that kind of open source view, there's a technology angle to it, right? There's something new that they want to do. And it's hard enough getting that right. With open source, you need to think about the fact that you're enabling your own competition, is the blunt truth of it. You're enabling people to compete with you with the benefit of all the things that you've done. And that can be both financially and emotionally very daunting. But at the end of the day, I don't see any other model for software which is spreading as fast across all of the kind of categories of software out there today. If you're not going to be open source, you're almost certainly going to be niche. Now, that may be satisfying for you, but I doubt it.
What Mark clearly sets out there is the business consequence of open sourcing your code. And that's a combination of licensing and enabling your competitors with your own innovation. And that's the business pain of using open source. Now, I've seen lawyers who've suggested that you can exclude that. You can stop others from using your code commercially in open source. And that's just simply not the case. I often think that confusion comes from Creative Commons, which is designed for documentation and which does allow that. There is a non-commercial usage license there. And the reason open source cannot have that exclusion is the open source definition, and definition 6, which requires that there is no discrimination across fields of endeavour. You may not restrict the program from being used in business. Now, there's no restriction on making money from open source. And of course, you can choose to exclude other people from using your source code. But if you do that, your code is proprietary and it's not open source. And that fact is really rather binary. When I left Canonical, I worked for a while advising startups, and they would come to me, understandably, to talk about open source. And I came up with a little theory, a very simple 3 questions. And that's the what if theory. What if someone else takes your code and uses it? Well, most people are okay with that. That's kind of what they're expecting with open source. What if they take your code and they make money from it? Less keen. What if they use your code and they make a lot of money from that and you make nothing or very little or significantly less? And at that point, I would often not hear from them again. Commercializing open source requires balance. It requires the balance between the scale that can be created and the adoption that comes from open source. And you're developing code that's not niche, and that has to be balanced against the price of non-discrimination, which must be allowed by all, and I repeat that, all open source licenses. Now, at this point, I could show you a variety of snippets of founders who've clearly not understood that when they've open sourced their code, but I don't really see any benefit in calling them out in that way. Instead, let's focus on the advantages and the business models. And I think we should go to Shannon Williams, founder of Rancher, co-founder of Rancher, which was sold to SUSE for $600 million in 2020.
It's at the root of our success. So by open sourcing the code, we enabled, a startup with relatively, with no name recognition, obviously, to come into, in a lot of ways, what's a very crowded market. We made Rancher fully open source and free because we felt that it was the best way to get adoption, to plant seeds in organizations that would need this technology.
Shannon's not alone in recognizing that rapid adoption of open source. And I'd like now to go to James Waters, co-founder of Pivotal, which was sold for $2.7 billion to VMware, also in 2020.
I really do enjoy working on open source projects because they can have a breadth of impact that's pretty unimaginable to something that you have to commit a sales transaction and for software before someone can use it. These are the kind of impacts that open source can have worldwide, deep into developer impact that you could never do with a closed source only, enterprise sale only product. I think just the unimaginable breadth that open source can get to and the ubiquity that it can get to in the modern world is stunning. So that's humbling to work on. I think the challenge then is how do you make sure that the largest, 5,000 organizations in the world are contributing to that? And that's where I do have a passion for enterprise monetization of open source and finding ways of partnering with those organizations and packaging and pricing things such that they feel that there's good value in partnering with these open source companies and making them their most meaningful platform.
So that marketing and growth advantage, which is the developer's ability in 2021 to go to GitHub, GitLab, or any other public repo and to take open source code, introduce it to their business, and avoid a procurement process. That's an ability to scale your code, your open source, that proprietary just cannot compete with. And it works really well in a developer-focused business model. Well, okay. Business models. So back in 2008, Matt Aslett, under the auspices of 451, created what's probably, if not definitely, the first report on open source business models. And one of the key findings then was that vendors must choose complementary development, licensing and revenue strategies in order to maximize revenue generation opportunities. And he identified the bottom line. And the bottom line was that open source is not a business model. It's a development and distribution model that is enabled by a licensing tactic. Now, Matt wrote that 13 years ago, and some things haven't changed much. The list of revenue generation models he gave isn't very different today. And he started with support, and we see support as one of the least popular models today because it's hard to scale. At the same time, we see successful businesses like Rancher and Percona using that. Another is subscription, a little like support, often including support, but with other services bundled around it, maybe indemnity, maybe updates. And that's Red Hat's model, which we saw lead in 2019 to the biggest tech transaction in history, Red Hat's sale for $34 billion. Now, whether that is something that's replicable really remains to be seen. And I think you need to be close to the key technology for it to work. And in Red Hat's case, they're very close to the Linux kernel. We will see whether it's repeatable because SUSE, which uses the same model and which describes itself as the biggest independent vendor of open source today, is going to IPO in June. So watch this space. Another is Open Core. You're probably surprised to find that in 2008, Aslett identified that most companies were using both proprietary and open source in their businesses. And they were doing that, he said, to balance a higher cost of development and marketing. Now, when Aslett wrote that, that was 2008, way before we had Git, before we had a GitHub economy. And this marketing advantage didn't exist at that time. So these costs today are much more balanced and there's less need to balance that. Yet we still see open core, particularly for the VC-backed Bay Area companies, as a popular model. And we have others like systems integrators and managed services providers who will generally provide services across a multitude of products, whether those are all open source or a mixture of open and proprietary. And the key issue that we're seeing today seems to be single product companies, single product vendors. Companies which work with a single product are obviously putting all their eggs in one basket, and this seems to be much more difficult and much more susceptible to the problems in the cloud environment. We see something different with multi-product vendors, and whether or not that single product vendor will survive as a model remains to be seen.
If you think about, how many projects you want to take on, like say MongoDB is a fairly focused company, one core thing, Elastic, a fairly focused company. But you get into the platform world, companies like HashiCorp are very successful at doing multiple projects. I think Pivotal is probably one of the broader breadth open source companies out there. Certainly Red Hat has a pretty broad breadth. You hit a point where you become the platform provider of choice for their next generation of design. And actually the pressure comes to do more and more and more. One of the biggest pressure points for us was always like, okay, we love this as an application platform. Now provide us the whole universe of data services on the platform. And so you have to achieve a certain critical mass to have the scale to invest like that. But I do think that in enterprise segmentation, it's powerful when you can start to have people accept the offerings you do have. And then the biggest pressure is, and now add this so I can have one coherent approach. And I think that that's something that's really important for open source companies to think about. Like, if you look at how Amazon operates, they are not a federation of hundreds of little hosting providers all coming together. They really have that sort of single point of interface to all of their abstractions. So I think that's an interesting dynamic in the world right now of open source, is like how broad you should go in your portfolio. Do enterprise buyers favor that? Is it better to be lower end single product?
Interestingly, Both Pivotal and Rancher, like many successful open source companies, are in the Kubernetes, the cloud space. But success doesn't just come in that space. We've also seen success in the database space with companies like Percona. And Percona is quite famous for not having VC backing or funding. So let's hear from founder Peter Zaitsev.
So if you look at where we started with essentially consulting, and especially consulting focused on the high performance applications for MySQL and MySQL alone. And this gradually extended both in terms of the services we offer. So right now we have support, management services, and professional services such as consulting and training. And in terms of technologies we cover, right? So right now we also cover MySQL, PostgreSQL, MongoDB, and MariaDB, right? So really the value proposition changed from essentially, hey, you know what, we can optimize your MySQL performance to what Percona helps you to run MySQL, PostgreSQL, MongoDB best.
Aslett warned us in 2008 that increased use of commercial licensing could create tension between the expectations of potential customers and commercial reality. Now, Aslett could not have understood how or why in 2008 this could come to fruition in the way that it has. And in the last few years, we've seen a small number of apparently successful companies based on open source with communities moving away from their open source licenses to proprietary alternatives. And this has sometimes been called a bait and switch tactic. And one of those companies has gone so far to say that it viewed open source as nothing more than a marketing tool. And this included companies like Redis, MongoDB, and Elastic. And we've seen a move to licensing like the Commons Clause and SSPL licenses. So back in 2018, Redis commissioned the Commons Clause, and it was drafted by lawyer Heather Meeker. And the Commons Clause is an add-on clause which is added to an open source license to exclude others from commercial usage, to exclude the competitors. And as soon as you add a clause to an open source license, an additional clause to an approved open source license, that license is invalidated because it's no longer an approved license. And we saw Redis move to it. The open source community greeted it with nothing short of horror. And then in 2019, Redis moved again. And this time they moved to a new proprietary license called the Redis Source Available license. So let's hear from Redis.
Although AGPL provides a little better protection than BSD, because you need to contribute back basically any enhancement that you do to the software, we didn't feel that this is a showstopper for cloud providers to adopt successful open source projects. And I'll explain. So what happened in recent years is as the cloud business grew, cloud providers such as AWS are adopting any successful open source project, making it a fully managed service and selling it for tens of millions, in the case of Redis, hundreds of millions of dollars per year.
So what is Redis talking about? Well, strip mining. Strip mining is a very US-centric term, and it's an analogy from a federal law created in the mid-1970s, which was designed to stop abuses of the land with companies strip mining coal from the land. And this alleged strip mining came to public attention in 2019 in a New York Times article where it was reported that a number of open source founders, companies that were running open source and distributing their code open source, had gotten together to complain about some of the hyperscalers, some of the cloud companies, including AWS, who made the headline. Unsurprisingly, Amazon was equally vociferous in its response to this, and while strip mining coal might be illegal, under federal law at least, using code which the originator has freely chosen to license under an open source license is entirely legal, and that was clearly pointed out by AWS's Andy Gutman. Elastic actually took matters further by instigating litigation on a trademark infringement basis against AWS. That seems to have disappeared. Nobody can quite tell me what's going on with that one. But on January 14th, 2021, Shai Bannon, founder of Elastic, made headlines by announcing they were doubling down on open, confusingly doubling down on open by moving from an open source Apache 2.0 license to the SSPL. Open source and business using open source has clearly, because of all of this, been in the eye of a storm for the last few years. And some in the open source community would describe this as FUD, deliberately confusing. And the SSPL is clearly not an open source license, but the confusion caused has meant that the Open Source Initiative, the OSI, has felt the need to come out and state this publicly. And a new term's emerged, and that's faux pen, where non-open source software tries to pass itself off as open when it's licensed under something like the SSPL. And MongoDB commissioned Heather Meeker to draft the SSPL a few years ago, but when they did that, they took it to the OSI, they went through the approval process, but before it could be rejected, I think they might have seen the writing on the wall, they withdrew it from the process. Now, an interesting structural fact about open source's shared nature and its licensing is that a community always has the opportunity to lift the code and move away in a fork. And that's exactly what's happened to Elastic. A little bit confusing because Elastic's moved to a proprietary model. It appears that Elastic is the one that's managing a proprietary fork, and the original code under the open source license is now being maintained by others, including Ivan.
It's often where it's really struggled, and where you've seen it struggle, is when organizations haven't had a great business plan or a route to market, or they haven't been able to commercialize their own product. And then all of a sudden it gets embedded into something larger, and then the only monetization of it happens in the cloud. To me, that's business, right? That's something that's going to happen in any space, whether it's open source or not. And yes, in our world, people can take and build on it very easily, but that's what you know what you're getting into when you start an open source software business. And if you don't, you really should research it a little bit more. This is the knife that cuts in many ways from a business perspective. And I certainly would look at the world, and I certainly wouldn't call foul if that happened to an open source project.
So how do we transition through this difficult cloud-based time? Well, I would suggest that we do it with great care, because carelessness in this world of open source, a lack of understanding of licensing and the OSD, could so easily break this beautiful thing that we've created and leave us back in a world where open source may be regurgitating proprietary code and a nasty mess of binary, and we lose what we've created. Now, some have suggested there's a third way, and you'll have noticed that I've explained very clearly the difference between open source and proprietary code. And they've suggested that there's a third way, an alternative that could be created. And that third way might be public or shared source, where source code is shared, but the code distribution doesn't have an open source license and it doesn't meet the standards of the OSD, potentially allowing it to exclude innovation being used by one's competitors. Personally, I don't think that's the solution. And I don't think it's the solution because I don't think there's the appetite for it. Because to create it would require three things. And it would require energy, it would require funding, and it would require engagement. And having seen Heather Meeker try to defend the Commons Clause to a room full of open source lawyers in 2019, there might be one or two who'll support it, but I think there are very, very few. There was no real appetite for this. Personally, I think there's a fourth way. Now, currently, emotions run really high. There's a lot of money at stake, as there was, I have to say, 10 years ago when I first came across this problem at Canonical. And in time to come, we will see different problems. We will see further issues with different business models, whether it's in the internet or AI. And we'll see more disruption coming from open source, and incumbents never loved disruption. In fact, if we think back 10 years ago, we saw similar problems around operating systems, and those were solved by antitrust cases and regulation. So how do we get over this strip mining? How do we get over this current problem? We look with the lens of the future and the learning of the past. Already since 2019, we've seen Google doing deals with open source companies to share revenue. In 2020, with companies like Grafana, AWS was also public and starting to do these. Some even allowed credits from the hyperscalers to be used to buy open source services. And I expect that this particular bump in the road, I expect that it will be resolved not by regulation, although it might be, but I think by negotiation. Remember at the beginning, I said open source is all around us. It's like gravity, you can't escape it. Well, today this problem isn't just open sources, it's societies, and it applies across all technology, across all infrastructure, and that means all businesses and government today. I started by thinking about what open source is, and one thing it is not is a business model. And as I come to the end of my time with you today, let's look at Mark Shuttleworth again, reflecting on 15 years in Canonical.
Some things really haven't changed. It is about enabling people to go faster with open source, to drive down the cost of open source, drive down the friction of open source. I don't see any other way of organizing software that seems poised to beat open source.
Bruce didn't come down from the mountain with the OSD carved in stone. You know, it is no 10 commandments. But the whole of society today relies on code that's distributed under software licensing that relies on that definition. And we must take great care of it. Of course, we must keep it under review, and we must also make sure that the OSI, its guardian, is well funded and well managed. But we must also remember that open source works to make the best software. When it comes to business, we must look to business models and the ever-evolving, ever-changing technologies that impact them. Open source will not bend to this, but rather these have to evolve to allow open source to thrive.
Thank you, Amanda, for a great presentation. If anyone would like to ask any follow-up questions for Amanda, she'll be answering them in the chat now. Our last keynote speaker of the day is Luis Villa. Luis will be discussing the hot topic of licensing, reviewing the history of licensing conflicts, and giving you guidance on what these new licenses mean for our industry and our future. Over to Luis.
Hi, I'm Luis Villa, and I'm an attorney, I'm a former programmer, and I've been involved in open source for over 20 years. And I'm here to talk about open-ish licenses and explain that it's not about you, and that's okay. This talk was originally titled Business Models, Ethical Tools, Neither, Both. But the longer I wrote, the more I realized this was the wrong frame. Asking, is the license a business model, makes it about the needs of the businesses who are writing these tools. And you, the audience today, are the people who are using these tools to build awesome, new, exciting things. You're not here to understand somebody else's business model. That is their problem, not yours. So today we're going to walk through and explain why, for many of you, this is a little bit of a tempest in a teacup. Another alternative title I briefly considered was How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the License, but nobody should love licenses. So you were spared yet another one of those. So what are we exactly talking about today? If you just dropped in, there's been a lot of news in the past couple of years. Mongo switches up its open source license. Elastic delivers blow to AWS. AWS fights back. And so we're going to try to make sense a little bit of that. Like I said, hopefully help you understand at the end of the day how to deal with that. In fact, let's get specific about our goals. The first one, I want to give you the tools to understand. When somebody from your team says, hey, I want to use one of these, but I don't understand the license, I want you to be able to give some good, useful, constructive advice. Secondly, I want to not bore you to tears. So that means hopefully very little actual reading of license texts, and but we'll see how that goes. So let's go back to this slide. Elastic delivers blow to AWS. A lot of fighting imagery here, a lot of talk about control. And but we need to go a little deeper to help understand what that is. So first of all, if you fell asleep in 2018, congratulations. You are the real winner here. And while you were asleep, let me give you a bit of a recap that goes a little bit deeper than some of those high-level headlines that we just showed. So first, while you were asleep, MongoDB announced, revised, and then withdrew, but still sort of continues to use the server-side public license versions 1 and 2. Redis first started using something called the Commons Clause. It's now partially under the original open source license and partially under something called the Redis Source Available license. Elastic and Kibana were placed themselves to great fanfare and great controversy, the server-side public license version 1.0, and are now also using something called the elastic license. Grafana went from being under the Apache license to being under the Affero General Public License, and something called VCR, which you probably haven't heard of, but you probably do use, went under something called the Hippocratic license. This is a lot of different acronyms that typically end in L: SSPL, AGPL, EL, RSAL. We're going to try not to go into the details of them. The key thing to take away here is that lots of folks tried to change the terms that they were using you under. And indeed, let's talk a little bit about why should you care. As I said at the very beginning, one answer is you should not care that much because this isn't about you. And we'll get to that at the end. But to get there, we have to do a little tour of some history first and a little tour of architecture and excavation. Here's the thing: licenses and databases are foundational. Your business is built on your data. And that means your business, to some extent, is built on the vendor of your data storage. They have a lot of power over you. And the license ultimately is a big part of how they exercise that power. In some ways, you can think of the license as an API to a legal system with certain calls, certain tools, certain levers. And so these really do matter. So let's learn a little bit more about the licenses. The one way that we can learn a little bit more about the licenses is read all of them in painstaking detail. Here we see the SSPL talking about the service source code means the corresponding source for the program or the modified version, and the corresponding source for blah, blah, blah. You're already asleep. I'm sorry. I told you goal number 2 was let's not fall asleep. So yeah, let's not do this one. And in fact, it's not just that it puts people to sleep. More importantly, actually reading the text of the license does not necessarily tell you a whole lot about how the text will be interpreted in practice. Contract source code is a lot like computer source code. If you are reading it in a vacuum, if you haven't compiled it, if you haven't understood what operating system is it going to run on, what is it going to run on AWS or GCP or bare metal, if you haven't done all those things, you're not necessarily going to understand how the code is going to read, is going to work in practice. Similarly, a license where you don't know a lot about that environment is actually not going to be very helpful. For example, licenses like source code have vulnerabilities that can be exploited. And so who's on the other side and what's their motivation? Are they going to try to exploit these vulnerabilities? Are they going to give you some buffer to understand and maybe tweak your behaviors? These things matter, and you can't tell them just from the raw text of the license. So instead, today we're going to focus a little bit on option number 2, ancient history. It's my opinion that we can learn more about what's going on right now by looking back at the history of open source rather than reading the text of licenses. So let's do that by hopping in our tech time machine and going all the way back to the ancient year of 1998. So in 1998, on the left was the GNU project and the Free Software Foundation. They had believed and had pushed for more than a decade the idea that access to source code was going to empower and indeed liberate human beings. By being able to access the source code of our code editor, of our compiler, of our operating system, we were going to make people better. This was a really noble cause and one that in many ways I personally still subscribe to. But as you may be aware, American business shies away a little bit from talking about freedom and liberation. And instead, they want to talk about things like, is it cheaper? Is it better? Is it more robust? So there was an opening. And the Open Source Initiative, a group founded in this fateful year of 1998, came along to talk about exactly that. Instead of talking about freedom, instead of talking about liberation, they talked about openness. You can imagine that this pissed off a lot of the people who are much more interested in freedom and liberation. But you may also have noticed that this was a year that was pretty foundational. MySQL, Mozilla, Linux, all of these things were really taking off in the late 90s. And the open source initiative and this mantra of openness really hit a nerve. Lots of people really loved that idea. But here's the thing, under the hood, there were a lot of similarities. And in fact, if you look at the list of licenses that were approved by both of these organizations, because licenses were the primary tool that they chose to use to advance either liberation or openness, the lists were essentially identical. Now they got to these identical things a little differently. The Free Software Foundation had 4 criteria, the Open Source Initiative had 10 criteria, but it turned out that when you evaluated those criteria, you got Spider-Man pointing at each other. The lists were basically identical. The goals were subtly different, but in practice, that really didn't matter that much. In the late 90s and the early 2000s, business, ethics, free, open, they were all highly aligned. There was tons of developer interest, and all those developers were taking a lot of time to learn about licensing and understand what was going on. There was money to go around and then some. There was lots of VC investing to back anything. And there were giant companies like Google and Facebook who were spinning off open source and open source code almost as an afterthought of their businesses, creating piles of source code, literally billions of lines. There were different licenses that helped users differentiate. So if you had different goals, you could use slightly different licenses and get to basically the same place. The net result was that there was very low tension in the movement. Now, these goals of freedom and openness were still rhetorically different. But as an actual practical matter, folks were not fighting very much over them. Or to the extent that they were fighting over them, again, rhetorically. Lots of angry, don't get me wrong, lots of angry emails were sent, but they were angry emails. So what happens next? Well, we are in the tech industry. And if there's anything that we know for certain about the tech industry, is that lots of things change. Now, it's important to stress here that open won, right? Everything I'm about to describe is a winner's curse, where things were so successful, so widely deployed, took over the entire economy, and yet that success is what actually showed us some of the flaws that I'm about to discuss. So what was change number one? Cheap and easy was, for a long time, something that free and open source software prided itself on. It was easy to find this stuff, it was easy to use it, and of course it cost you nothing. And so this was great, but at some point along the way, that became mandatory, or what we used to call at Mozilla table stakes. If you didn't have those things, don't bother to show up, because if you're not cheap and easy, developers are going to ignore you. It was desirable, but optional, and then somewhere along the way, it became required. The impact of this is just like this child forced to dress up, but honestly not happy about being in the picture. There were lots of companies that were forced into open. They didn't like it. They didn't want to do it. Unsurprisingly, when you require something, some people immediately start chafing. These companies were giving it away because that's what the market expected, but they didn't have to like it. And their sales and marketing teams particularly didn't like it, because it meant they were not just competing, but they were competing with their own product at no cost. As a result, people were dressed up in their collars, but they were pretty unhappy. So change number two, the platforms embraced open source. For a long time, the platforms, particularly Microsoft, did not significantly embrace open source. In fact, Microsoft actively detested it for a long time. So there was a lot of space for you as a small fish to build without worrying about dominant competitors. But that has really changed. AWS, Azure, Google Cloud, all of them build extensively on FOSS and productize FOSS. So if you're in this space, say, for example, you're a database vendor, well, lots of people want anti-platform weapons because they're worried about this competition. They're thinking, I have to compete with Amazon? That's no fun. This is no surprise, of course. And in fact, businesses since the dawn of time have tried to draw moats, literal or otherwise. But it does beg the question, what's the form that these moats are going to take? So change number three is that open is everywhere, including in bad places. The wild success of open source means that open source is on Mars. Hooray. I loved that, loved the helicopter video as much as anybody. But it also means that open is powering carbon emitting power plants. It means that open is powering bombs and tanks. And it means that it's powering databases that monitor and probably even implement ethnic cleansing. Impact number 3, therefore, is not surprising. People saying not just there's no way all my outrage can fit on a sign, they're saying there's no way all my outrage can fit into a license, but I'm going to try. The final change that I want to point out, and one that's a little more subtle, is that free and open source licenses no longer cause friction. This is the change that enables the other 3 changes. If the licenses still caused friction, cheap and easy would not have become the norm. If the licenses still caused friction, platforms would not have embraced free and open. And if the licenses still caused friction, open source software might not be involved in so many things total, including so many bad things. So why don't they cause friction anymore? It's more than we can go into super deeply today, but the changes include how the licenses are used, which licenses are used, and simply how lawyers are trained. What used to be a niche is now something taught by default in essentially all law school intellectual property courses. It's literally hard to graduate from law school now without having at least some understanding of open source if you want to do intellectual property. The pendulum has come back, and now at least some people, these businesses, these activists, want friction. And we know how lawyers enjoy throwing sand in the gears. The best way to do that is to write new licenses. So that gets us to this hard question. Do these new licenses solve these problems? A little unclear that they're actually problems, because for many people, these are huge benefits. And it's definitely unclear the licenses are the right tool to solve. But let's look a little bit more deeply. I did promise we would not read a lot of text, but I do want to share some. There's this group of licenses that are trying to solve the business problem. And again, remember, whose business problem is a really important question here. This license, the Commons Clause, says, without limiting other conditions in the license, the grant of rights does not include and does not grant to you the right to sell the software. So what this is trying to do is essentially saying, look, you want to use it, you're not a competitor of mine, great. But if you're a competitor, let's talk. Lawyers are going to get involved. So this is solving a problem to some extent for businesses that are using Commons Clause. It's literally, by its terms, deflating competition, trying to stop competition. Is that actually solving its problem for you? Are you a competitor? This is where getting back and understanding that there's a deep and rich history here really helps you understand that you may or may not be a competitor, and it may be hard for you to know before the fact. Similarly, a moral problem with the ethical open licenses. There are definitely very real moral problems here. Are licenses the right way to go about solving them? Attempts to do this have included 996 ICU, which was an attempt to attack business and employment practices in China, the Hippocratic license, which we'll quote from in a second, the atmospheric software licenses, which were all about carbon. These things are real risks that, real problems that we as a society have to tackle. Licensee is advised to consult the articles of the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights and United Nations Global Compact that define recognized principles of international human rights, the quote, human rights principles. I guarantee you have no one on your legal team who is familiar with these principles. Now, they may think of themselves as really good people. And in fact, in their spare time, maybe activists of various sorts. I certainly am. But this is not something that's printed out and stacked on their desk. It's not bound behind them. And so it's really hard for them to understand what's going on here. Again, friction has been introduced. It's friction in the name of a very good cause, but whether or not it's actually working, it's going to be hard to tell. There's a common thread between both these ethical and business things. It's a solution for them, which is to take back control. Now, I'm going to put aside whether or not this control actually works. We have very little evidence of it working in the ethical space, and in the business space, market valuations of some of the companies who have tried this have actually gone down since they announced license changes. So it's a little unclear whether or not this actually works, but people are trying. People have found themselves in a situation where they have little or no control, or at least the legal terms give them little or no control. Again, a topic for another longer talk. And so they're trying to re-exert it. Here's the thing, though. This is not about you. And this is where we'll get back to, if there's any one takeaway you take from this talk, it's that, look, I see some people saying that these vendors are trying to fool you or deceive you or whatever. This may or may not be true. I'm sure some salespeople and marketing people see it that way. I'm sure they're trying to get you, the first one's always free, right? But this isn't a very useful frame. The useful frame is that these discussions are about a multi-decade discussion about power, control, ethics, and business. Who has control over software? And so it isn't about you. It's about them, about how they're trying to re-exert control. And so here's the thing. The solution for you is the same as it is anybody tries to exert power over your business. Recognize the power is being exerted, negotiate, or use something else. There's no deep wizardry. There's no, oh, I need to learn deeply about this class of licenses. No, this class of licenses is trying to exert power over you. And so do the same thing that anybody else, that when Oracle does it, Oracle doesn't pretend to be open. Oracle just comes in and sits down and says, we have a license negotiation. Treat these the same way. That's okay. They're trying to do the right thing for the business. You're trying to do the right thing for yours. Just don't pretend that there's any deep veneer, any moral cause or business cause here. You're just trying to work with each other as partners, as businesses. And that's all right. Thank you and good luck.
That was great, Luis. Thanks for joining us and thanks for a great talk. So that wraps up today's keynotes. We appreciate you tuning in, and a big thank you to our presenters. Please don't go anywhere yet. We still have lots of great sessions to come this morning or afternoon or evening, depending on where you are in the world. Take a look at the schedule to see what's coming up and enjoy the rest of today's conference. We'll see you here at the same time tomorrow, again, for our final keynotes. Take care.